All right, so we're getting started. Welcome, everyone. You have joined the session From Data to Action, How to Turn Innovative Research into Behavioral Change. So if your flight is going anywhere else, now would be the time to step out. My name is Clayton Lane. I'm with Bird as of yesterday, my first day, leading global public policy work. Thanks. I'm also the chair of the board of the Shared Use Mobility Center. I'm really excited that we all could be together. So for this session here, we're going to talk about, we're going to ask the questions, what does it take for TNC passengers to choose shared rides instead of solo products? What are riders' biggest barriers to mobility on demand adoption? And what are the benefits, impacts, and opportunities for micromobility to transit ridership and to the built environment? So this session will showcase the latest research on shared mobility impacts, followed by a discussion on how we can leverage data to change behaviors toward more equitable, sustainable travel. So I will begin by first introducing our esteemed speakers today. Then we'll have very brief presentations from each, just to introduce the research that they've done, so we all know what we're talking about together here. Then I'll just ask a round of 2 quick questions about impact and roles and how we can achieve the impact we want to see in our space. And with time permitting, we can also ask and engage you to ask questions as well. That'll take us fully to 50 minutes, no problem. So I think it's going to be a really engaging, interesting session, and I'm really glad to have so many of you here to join us. All right. So I will introduce from my right, your left, toward the screen. First is Nicole DuPuis, Vice President of Innovative Mobility and Engineering Technology at ITS America. That was resilience. Dr. Nicole DuPuis is ITS America's VP for Emerging Technologies and Innovative Mobility, and over the course of her career, her work and research has investigated the role technology plays in impacting various facets of human life, including mobility and travel behavior, professional industrial shifts, and policymaking and governance tendencies. Her writing and work has been featured in TechCrunch, Governing, Route 50, and CityLab, among other outlets. Prior to joining ITSA, she worked for the American Public Transportation Association, Gartner, and the National League of Cities. It's great to have you. Thanks for being here, Nicole. Next toward your right is Alan Greenberg, Senior Policy Analyst at Federal Highway Administration. You look surprised, Alan, is that correct?
Yeah, no, all good.
Okay. Alan has analyzed and advocated for sustainable U.S. transportation policy from both inside and outside government for over 25 years. As a senior policy analyst at FHWA, Alan cultivates, develops, and manages transportation demand management and pricing pilot initiatives and research, including projects related to new mobility. Alan holds a master's in urban and regional planning, and a BS in public policy. Thanks for being here, Alan. And then finally, we have Colin to your far right. Colin is the Director of Research and Consulting at SUMC, the Shared Use Mobility Center. He works on SUMC's research efforts. He was the lead writer and researcher on all 4 of SUMC's TCRP studies and leads teams for shared mobility research and consulting work in communities across the US. And before SUMC, Colin worked with Smart Growth America's National Complete Streets Coalition and the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago. Colin holds a BA from UT Austin and a master's in public policy. So fantastic. I'm really excited to have us all here. Also, having checked out the research, I think is really interesting. So let's get right to it. We will start with Colin. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Clayton. Congratulations on your new role. I just heard that. Right
Thank you.
there, so.
Yeah.
So we're talking about scooters. We're talking about micromobility in general, so shared scooters, shared bikes. And this is mostly from a study that came out last year that SUMC co-authored with our friends at Populous and at Nelson Nygaard, and that really covered quite a wide range of questions that we don't remotely have time to cover today. So we're going to just concentrate on just a few key pieces of it. But mainly what it boiled down to was there's lots of research out there about how municipalities and micromobility interact. There's a lot less about how transit agencies in particular interact with micromobility. So, and part of that has to do with the different regulatory or just permitting sorts of roles that transit agencies have versus municipalities. But there's a wide range of questions that we dealt with here. So I'm skipping over most of it. I'm sort of going to the third question about what transit agencies need to understand about micromobility, and then how that sort of will guide how they will partner with micromobility operators. So I should state first off that lots of this research took place before COVID. So, or it was sort of being written at the height of things over 2020 and 2021. So there's a good chance some of what we've seen here has changed, and I'd be interested to see how that goes. So the core sort of data portion of this work, as opposed to the policy portion, was conducted by Populous. There was, they have a representative survey that they do called the Ground Truth Survey that looks at micromobility users versus the general population and differentiates between people who have used micromobility in general versus only scooters, and then people who haven't used micromobility at all. We took that and divided it into different types of cities and different types of transit, or different levels of transit availability in those cities. We came up with these 4 groups, and really what we found was that a whole lot depends, unsurprisingly, like everything else, on urban form and on the availability of transit. This chart that I know takes a while to digest is showing that most of the connections to transit by scooter happen in sort of medium density cities. And the very most connections to public transit happen in medium density, low transit cities. So I think that's pointing to sort of the importance of micromobility as a connector, as a last mile, especially in places where you can't rely on the bus getting you there. You know, you can't just walk to the bus stop and know that the bus is going to show up. It might be in 45 minutes or an hour between buses. And then at the high transit end of things, you see less of that, frequent connection to transit by micromobility, and then the same at the low end, where probably transit is mostly not an option for most trips anyway. Similarly, we see that where there is more transit availability, you see scooters used in a more utilitarian way. People are using it for commutes, people are using it for shopping and errands, whereas at the other end of the scale, at the low density, low transit, it's mostly just joyrides. It's mostly people doing it for fun, much less so using it for getting around the city in kind of a functional way. So again, I think that's pointing to the importance of that micromobility can't build on nothing. It needs things to connect to. It needs a robust public transit system to connect to, and it can't replace that. So this is another set of data. So this comes from Populous's work, where they work as an intermediary between micromobility providers and cities, and aggregate and digest the data that the providers are putting out and make it useful for cities. through sort of a dashboard of where rides are happening, a more anonymized dashboard of where rides are happening when, and they can also look at enforcement and that sort of thing. So this is looking at trips that begin or end at different distances from high-frequency transit lines. And so in Arlington, Virginia, in the DC area, nearly where it's very well covered by high-frequency transit, nearly every transit ride, or every micromobility ride ends within about a mile of transit, and then about 42% of them end within an eighth of a mile of transit. So those are the ones that we're thinking are most likely to be actually last mile connections. At the other end of the spectrum, this is in Baltimore, where there is much less coverage by high-frequency transit, and you see a lot fewer of those connections. So again, the greater the quality of transit, the more nearby origins or starts and stops of trips you see. So what does this mean for transit agencies, especially in terms of the role that they have in the regulatory regime? Cities are really the regulators and right-of-way managers and transit agencies have a lot less power to compel action or dictate where things happen, especially once it's off of the real estate that they control. So, but the key areas that transit agencies are interested in are enhancing access and increasing ridership, working with cities to reduce those highest loads at peak hour and getting people maybe off of the super crowded buses and onto other modes if possible, to allow greater capacity within their systems, and then also to take the data that they're getting from micromobility systems to help give a clue to where there might be demand for transit elsewhere in the system that isn't currently being supplied. But their role is really much more as a partner, as an integrator, but less so as a regulator or entity that can compel things. So there's a variety of different ways that they can do this, going from direct operation or subsidy of public transit, of micromobility, to more just working with their municipal partners on making things happen and maximizing public benefit. There's a whole lot in this report. I encourage you to check it out. For agencies that are interested and think it's in their interest to pursue working with micromobility operators, there's a partnership toolkit that has a series of tools to help agencies think through those steps and really consider whether it is something that's worthwhile to pursue or not. So that's it for me.
Great stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was really interesting, and I'm so eager to dive in, but let's hold off. So next up, who's? I think you said Nicole. Nicole, I think I said Nicole as well, so let's go with that. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and I'm really excited to be here to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done in this space. Just before I get started here, I just want to provide a quick overview of the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. We are an advocacy group for the development and deployment of ITS technology, and we have a vision for a safer, greener, and smarter future. Let's see if I can get this to work. It is not up here. Oh, user error. So we do a lot of work in the mod space, mobility on demand space, and we've actually, over the last couple of years, engaged in 2 survey efforts. One focused on practitioner, kind of a state of the industry for practitioners, so the agencies and mobility providers that are deploying mobility on demand services, and another survey that we've done with AAA that looks at consumers, the public's perception of mobility on demand, of course, including things like scooters, bike sharing, car sharing, microtransit, micromobility. The survey that is focused on kind of public perception is the one I'm going to focus on today, and it looks at things like how people see mobility on demand services, how they see them benefiting or creating challenges in their communities. The survey also looked at the impacts of COVID-19 on the use of mobility on demand, and looked at kind of different user communities, the way people are using and thinking about all of these kind of somewhat new services or new service models. So that's really where I'm going to focus today, and I'm just going to try to provide a little bit of an overview. Here are 2 studies that we've done of some of the kind of high-level takeaways from that survey in particular. So just kind of a snapshot of who is using mobility on demand. Older Americans use MOD services at a much lower rate, but ridership among baby boomers and folks classified as pre-boomers are definitely highest in urban settings. We also noted that non-white individuals are generally more likely to use mobility on demand, especially in urban settings. And across all communities, ride-hailing is the most widely used form of mobility on demand. So a little nuance to that, for mobility on demand users, rented bikes and scooters typically replace walking, whereas ride-hailing, such as Lyft or Uber, typically replace rides from friends, public transit, or the traveler's own vehicle. So you can kind of see not just who is using mobility on demand services, but what they're using it in place of. And unfortunately, only 13% of the respondents in the survey would likely give up their personal vehicle in favor of on-demand options within the next couple of years. Again, I do feel it necessary, just as Colin did, to mention we did start this survey effort previous to COVID. It does take into account some of the impacts of COVID, but certainly if we were to do this same survey today, we might get different responses. And in addition to comments, in addition, much better, to comments about mobility on demand's role in improving mobility, nearly 1 in 5 mobility on demand users cited improved community safety, including things like reductions in drunk driving, just safer mobility trends that come out of mobility on demand implementation. Users generally think their community is better off. 66% of mobility on demand users indicated that they felt their community was better off with mobility on demand services, regardless of how urban, suburban, or rural the community was. And they cited things like fewer DUI episodes, easier trip planning, faster trip times. Those were some of the more common benefits that were cited in bringing mobility on demand services into the ecosystem. So I will stop there. There are a lot of things I could go into, but I do want to honor, our limited time and take questions from all of you. But I will say, I do want to plug one thing. We are hosting, with support from USDOT's ITS Joint Programs Office, a mobility on demand peer exchange next week, May 24th. If anybody is interested in participating in that, it's virtual. Do see me after our session here, and I will set you up with the details. But thank you. I'll turn things back over to our moderator.
Great, and really interested to learn more about the peer exchange too. Thanks for presenting the research. Super interesting again, but let's hold off discussing it for a bit. And Alan, go right ahead.
Good morning. Standard disclaimer, you don't hold me responsible for anything I'm about to say, so there you go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about TNC's, Transportation Network Company, vehicles and their impacts, and how to improve environmental performance and equity. There's been a fair amount of research on TNC's impacts on cities. Nationally, their impacts are fairly small, but in individual cities, they can be quite large. San Francisco, for example, did a model, and between 2010 and 2016, they attributed about half the increase in delay to the use of TNCs. Some have suggested that shared TNCs might lessen some of that response, some of the concerns, and that's true. They may not lessen them fully for some people. One figure, Bruce Shallard, did a lot of research, and he found that TNCs are adding more than twice the mileage that they're suppressing. So, but if you survey TNC users, there's a lot of benefit and so on and so forth, similar to personal automobility. And so that's sort of the tension. I personally think there, and research shows that sharing TNC rides might be kind of a sweet spot in terms of balancing individual needs, inequity, and system constraints. Okay, so we worked with a major TNC. They did a big survey of 4,300 users across 15 cities. 70, and it was focused on their last trip. 72% were riding alone, 28% were shared. These services have stopped during the pandemic. I think they're going to be starting to come back. So, so that's the focus of this particular research. A lot of questions about the trip were asked, and then data was appended, depersonalized, related to what quintile people were in terms of their trip making and so on and so forth. And then there was a stated preference component where we took the trip they just took and we expanded their choice set to what if this was offered, what if that was offered. And that was the source of data that we used FHWA to develop a tool. It's a slide scale tool. We put this out a little bit over a year ago and part of a major report, and I can give people a link to that if they want to do that. So it's the use of the tool that I've come back to doing to test some scenarios, and that's why I'm here today. Not surprisingly, by the way, the poorer people share more than richer people. The poorest group was sharing 39% of their last trips, the richest group 24%. When you test different price mechanisms, you get quite variability as to what changes people are making. Not surprisingly, again, the poorer people will change a lot more based on price, richer people change a lot less. When you put in a time element, though, we're not changing the price, we're changing the trip time difference. That's quite even, actually, across different demographics, with one exception. Poor people actually move less with the trip time differential between the shared and the regular being suppressed. Rich people move a little bit more. And if you set out the goal that we're trying to increase by 10 percentage points, the portion of people sharing trips, you would have to you'd have to increase the price differential by 35% to get that, but the time differential you'd only have to suppress by 12%. So there's a lot more you can get more impact per unit of proportional change through time than price. And significantly, you're getting that impact by having the wealthier people move when you do time versus when you're doing price, it's the opposite. So that's a big, if you think not having to change your plans is advantageous, then that would be equity enhancing when you focus on the time differential. If you look at Chicago, there's some really good data. This isn't ours. Soria and Stepopoulos, I'm mispronouncing his name. Shared TNC trips are very diffused. Solo TNC trips are in the northeast quarter, which is where all the transit is too. They have a socially disadvantaged index. In the places that are more disadvantaged, you see more sharing, and so on and so forth. So sharing actually is doing quite a lot in terms of serving people that are of diverse incomes, and so that does seem to be a sweet spot. Now, really interestingly, if you look at the corridors, and we knew the origin destinations, if you look at the corridors that have the best bus service, the 90 percentile, what I just described to you is even more true. Price moves people less in the bus corridors, and time moves people more in the bus corridors. So, and this is because you got wealthy people who they don't care about money, maybe their employer's paying for the trip, but time is really important. So if the time differential gets suppressed, and what does that mean, by the way? Suppressing the time differential means probably adding time to match the ride alone, but also maybe reducing the time for the shared, because you're going to have more people requesting that. And significantly, you're increasing bus speeds in those corridors. Just a scaling factor, the mean city of the 15 that we tested, there were 5.9 riders in a TNC, shared TNC, and a bus over a solo TNC. So if you're adding some time, that's the ratio. You're helping 6 people for every person you're delaying a bit. So we applied this particular tool. It looked like there was a policy sweet spot which is adding a 5-minute increase in the decrease rather in the time differential between the shared and non-shared. And when we did it, you got about doubling the rate of sharing. The rate of sharing about reached 50% in most markets. Then we looked at it a little bit differently. We said, well, what if we wanted to hit the rate of 50%? And the medium market value for that was 4.9 minutes, so it's spot on. If you want to cut in half the share of solo, which is harder because there's a higher share, you'd have a medium time differential of 7.5 minutes. So I'll stop there.
So that means you have to save 7.5 minutes.
That means if the time differential, if you were to cut the time differential, which might be by adding some time to the solo trip,
Okay.
and reducing some time of the share trip. If you increase that, if you brought that time differential down by 7.5 minutes, you would cut in half the number of solo TNC trips that people were taking.
Okay, got it.
And again, it was anchored off of a trip that people just took, so all the context was there. It wasn't like, oh, I'm theoretically a great person, I'll give you all the right answer. No, you were tired, you were whatever it was, you were exhausted, you know, at that moment it was raining, whatever it was, we put you in that mindset. It was a trip you just took. Here's an expanded choice set. So anyway, lots to talk about, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
That's fascinating research. Great. So, so let's dive in. I have so many questions. I'm just going to be a bit provocative and draw some light conclusions and ask you to tell me why I'm wrong, or you have other ideas, or whatever it is. Let's just start with Alan. So just to clarify, you know, a 5-minute reduction in that time differential could increase the share of shared rides to 50%. That's a big takeaway from your research.
And
huh?
we have numbers for each of the 15 markets, but that's about and I could actually have those if someone's in a major-ish city and they say, hey, what are the numbers? I can show. But
Yeah.
yes, it is.
That's a fascinating conclusion or result. I want to come back to it in asking how do we get there, but first let's just focus on impacts across the board here. Colin, in some of the research that you showed, I saw in there, it seemed like scooters are really, people are really using scooters as an extension of public transit. If I was looking at that data right, it seemed to suggest over 60% of scooter users are saying they use them to get to and from transit more than half the time in cities with good transit. Is that what it says?
Well, that I would need to think about that and look at the
Yeah.
chart that you're talking about. But the thing that's maybe different about what you see in this report versus a lot of what's out there is that this was weighted by the frequency of use.
Mm-hmm.
So the more somebody uses scooters, the more their responses were weighted. So it's not just, you know, yeah, I rode a scooter once last year in Chicago, and here was my perception of it. It's, you really get a sense of, you know, the people who are incorporating scooters into their life versus the people who are just doing it here and there.
Right, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it does show that there is good connection and especially last mile
Yeah.
sort of usage of scooters. It's probably replacing a lot of walk trips,
Yep. Yep.
frankly, but.
That was a surprise for me. I really thought scooters were used just for the whole trip. But you showed that geographic correlation with transit as well.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of respondents also were saying, I use this for commuting.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like that commute via transit, sort of an extension of the bus system, if you will, is kind of that role that scooters are playing in many people's lives, huh?
Yeah, and I think it gets into when you want to be out in the air, but you're wearing a suit and you don't want to get sweaty, so you might not choose a bike that day, but you still want to get there faster than it would take you to walk.
Right,
So,
yeah. That's really, really interesting.
yeah.
So Nicole, I was fascinated to see what a small percent of people in your national survey really said, hey, I've used a lot of mobility on demand, especially the micromobility. Now, your survey also was looking at a much wider swath of respondents than these other two surveys, because you're looking at folks in suburban areas and rural areas. But maybe it's the closest cross-section of America of all the research here. And it's kind of saying that, well, shared mobility, micromobility may have an important but a small role. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it brings up two really important points. I don't even know if this is working, so I'm just going to speak loudly. I think it brings up two important points. Yeah, not a lot of people using mobility on demand. 62% of our respondents have never used it, right? But I think it brings up an important point that this looks very, very different in urban communities, suburban communities, inner ring suburbs versus outer ring suburbs probably, and rural communities. And we can't just boilerplate that conversation, especially when we're considering bringing new services into a community. The needs are going to be very different. The community acceptance is going to be very different. The questions around access are going to be very different. And so, I think that, we have kind of a nuanced cross-section here that says, surprise, surprise, people in urban areas are more likely to use micromobility or mobility on demand services. But, I think that kind of brings to the surface a little bit of a problem, is that we're thinking about these services in the same way for very different communities with very different travel behaviors and patterns. So I think that we can kind of, from that, say, okay, how do we need to rethink the deployment of these services or the communication around these services, or where we cite these services? There's a lot we can kind of learn from that.
Yeah, different services may serve different needs better, and therefore different people better, right? Also, I would suggest the impacts of the different services may be different. We heard from Alan that the research is showing that the TNCs generally are adding miles to the roads, whereas you're suggesting here, and so was Colin, that the micromobility may be maybe not adding so many miles, maybe replacing some walking trips, helping people get to transit.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing. I think this is an example of a lot of times this happens, our VMT goals conflict with our climate goals, right? So we have, in this case I mentioned, for the folks in our survey who are mod users, rented bikes and scooters are taking the place of walking, and ride hailing is taking the place of transit and rides from friends. So, you could argue, are more people using micromobility? Are we getting people out of cars? Maybe. Are we, what are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing vehicle miles traveled? Are we prioritizing climate goals? Are we prioritizing lowering the number of single occupancy vehicles? All of those are really important, but you have a little bit of a shift in kind of what kind of bubbles up to the surface.
I feel like in some of the data that your research uncovered, you get different answers when you look at different parts of the data. So for example, like you just said, well, a lot of folks are shifting from walking to micromobility. But if we ask a different question of the data, well, what portion of them are shifting away from driving or some motorized vehicle? We might find some, let's call it positive impacts of less VMT. Do you think that may be the case here?
I mean, Generally, yes. I think that if you were to look exclusively at the climate outcomes here, you might say, well, ultimately walking is the best bet. We want people to walk, but people are not going to walk. I think answering the behavioral question of all, it's like the million, billion, $trillion question. And so, I think that, not to say, I don't want to imply that we just need to like settle for the best bet, but certainly we do have to kind of prioritize what we want our outcomes to be, and what we're going to say, okay, that's an improvement about, so yeah, certainly if you ask different questions of the data in our survey, you will find that it's probably a net positive, right? But if you were to be looking at that through, say, a VMT lens, you might not feel that way.
I think something you just said is really interesting. If you start with the outcome in mind first, say that you're developing policy goals or operational goals, and you have the outcome, you try to work backwards, you could actually design the system in a way to achieve, say, societally positive outcomes. And I think, Alan, that's what your research is showing, right?
Yeah, you could do it. I mean, part of the 5-minute was, okay, that's kind of reasonable, and it looked like it would actually have a large impact. That's why we ran it. But then we said, well, let's just start with the impact. Now, there are implementation. We'd have to figure out how to implement it. You'd have to be reading I don't know all the data side of that. I know the TNCs have it and how that would be implemented, but it actually doesn't have to. It could be a public policy. Actually, some years ago, Lyft actually said that was their goal. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they could choose. I mean, it's a competitive landscape, so maybe there's limitations to that. But in theory, they could make choices to get themselves there.
Yes.
So.
I want to come back to that in just a moment. Last thing on this impact piece, Nicole, the ITS research is also showing only 13% of people would, perhaps reduce their car ownership by adopting micromobility. Sounds small, but on the other hand, if generically we are presented with information that 13% of Americans would reduce their car ownership for something that would not cost trillions of dollars of investment, that would seem like the most transformational impact on car ownership since perhaps the 1950s. That sounds also pretty large.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I don't mean to, belittle that outcome. I think, we also found that respondents in the survey who are younger are more likely to give up their cars. So I think that maybe it's indicative of a trend that we would say is a good one. But it also kind of speaks to and again, this is pre-COVID, right? It may be very different now. It also kind of speaks to this kind of very, anecdotal observation where anytime there's any kind of a hitch or kind of an inconvenience, there's no willingness to give on the convenience factor. So, a little troubling, but you're right. Totally something worth, kind of clinging to and saying, oh, well, this, there is some positive impact here.
Yeah. How do we make it happen?
Yeah.
So on that note, Alan, let's get to the question. How do we make those 5 minutes happen?
It would be the sharing of a lot of data. Well, first of all, I would encourage, one possibility is that TNC could cooperatively work with the city to figure this out together. TNC can do it on its own, or a city could have an ordinance that would require the sharing of a lot of the data, including before conditions, with whatever you want to achieve, whether you want to. There is an advantage of putting in the time policy rather than an outcome policy, because if you do an outcome policy, you might, and you're not specific enough, they might be getting the outcome outside the transit corridors, and or they might, if they do a lot on the price side, they might be harming the lower income people more than on the, however, that's a reasonable debate as to how much you're interfering with a product versus giving people what they want. 30% of people, by the way, may know, when we said the time was the same, and you said 75%, 30% just didn't make any change at all. I'll say one other thing. What was really interesting is there was quite a heterogeneity in people's trade-offs. So if I were a TNC, rather than showing everyone just one shared option, I would show a couple, and I would specifically offer a time guarantee to some number of people. Like, some people are willing to give up 5 or 10 minutes if they knew it. And so if you gave me that, and that was an issue with the shared, is if you look at other surveys, some people don't trust the amount of time that the TNCs are giving there. So there really is a lot. More than anything, I just wanted people to think that playing in this space has the potential to have a large impact. The precise way to do it, I think there are some alternatives on that.
Right. But I think you're suggesting here that maybe a simple regulation that says, all right, the time differential between a solo or shared ride can be no longer than this amount, and perhaps the operator can also guarantee that the rider won't have to wait any longer than that, right?
That's a sort of, you could play with your trade-offs on that, but it would be that sort of thing.
Yeah. Colin, I'm so curious to dive into transit agencies, but I see you thinking as well. Do you have any comments on all these discussions so far?
I was just thinking that a lot of this comes down to people making choices that minimize their discomfort. Whatever, like, they're going to make the trip that they need to make and get to the place that they need to get to, but they're going to choose the way of getting there that is the least uncomfortable to them. Whether that's price, that's the thing that is driving it, whether it's being late to the meeting, or whether it's, you know, being out in the weather, whatever it is. And so I think to the degree that, you know, and I think also the friction from one, you know, getting into a mode, getting from one mode to another influences that as well. So I think to the degree that we can think about minimizing that discomfort, like, that's why TNCs took off over taxis, because it's the same thing, it's just a lot nicer. Or it briefly was. So.
Yeah, it's a really powerful lesson I think we've learned over the decades now is, you know, shared mobility has the ability to really transform behavior because it just works for people on an individual basis, right? And so people, by acting in their self-interest, can really do some good things for society as well. On that note, Colin, what should be the role of transit agencies in collaborating with micromobility operators? Your research showed a variety of different approaches. So, you know, if there's a transit agency in the room here, what's the 1 or 2 key takeaways you would suggest of how to collaborate with these operators?
I think it would be in places where there's already micromobility and a lot of usage, it would be working with them to kind of minimize disruption, minimize kind of organize the vehicles, make sure there's a clear place for people to park them, and that's out of the way of people walking. You know, keep things clear and organized for everybody, whether they're on or off micromobility. I think in some markets where you know, the private sector is not clamoring to put scooters and bikes down, it is about actively collaborating and bringing an operator to town, and then proactively, you know, tying that to transit service, whether it's through actual service integration or just making sure that there are stations or vehicles, you know, at important transit transfer points. So I think it really, again, depends on where you're at.
And what's that mechanism for collaboration? Is it a service contract with an RFP, or just a?
Yeah, I mean, like in Dayton, Ohio, they actually are operating scooters and bikes. The public transit agency has the garage. The scooter company supplies the vehicles, but it's, you know, transit agency employees who are doing the redistribution and the day-to-day maintenance. And so that's, you know, that's a service contract. But elsewhere, it could just be like a more MOU type of agreement.
I think that first one is really interesting because the transit agency is there positioning itself as a mobility provider, not a transit operator, and saying as part of mobility, we want certain options available, and we're going to hire a service provider to provide those options, but at a fee. That operator doesn't take the revenue risk, the public does. There's some subsidy. Yeah. All right, we've got 2 minutes, so let's just have like one or two quick questions. We'll see if we'll get some insight here. Anything that's really burning on your mind, take it away, and let's see what our panelists have to say.
Thanks. Russ Balzer, World Auto Steel. A question for Alan. We talked about cost, and we talked about time of trips. Nicole Sanguinetti from UC Davis has done some work on the sort of physical model of the transit in terms of sharing and encouraging people to share what the actual vehicle sort of configuration is. Are you guys doing any work there?
And before you get into it, any other quick question that we could add to the mix here? Any other, can be on any topic related to today? Please, yeah.
Yeah, it was a question in relation to the data Nicole shared, and just thinking about how valuable that data is for capturing information about behavior change for people who are not currently taking this shared mobility, and wondering what other opportunities there are for collecting that kind of data on a more regular basis to really understand and better shape policy and measure impacts on an ongoing basis.
And then one more quick one.
Yeah, real quick. Colin, you were kind of getting into it for a bit with MOUs through Dayton and micromobility, transit operators being the actual operator. But we talked a lot about policy today. Transit agencies are regional operators that cross multi-jurisdictions, where the teeth often falls in regulatory bodies with local government. Does it fall on transit agencies' shoulders to pursue and implement all of these policies, or who should be the convener in that?
So I welcome any of you to respond to any of those
This
questions.
is perfect. They actually had a question for each of us. So, I'll start. I've read some research on people designing vehicles with separate compartments and that sort of thing, but I'm not aware. I'm not involved in that, nor am I aware of work that we're doing in that space. I will make one comment, though, related to that. So time and price were the main factors that were influencing people, but there are some other factors that sometimes come into play. Women passengers are particularly interesting. I thought that they wouldn't want to share as much, but in some cases they prefer it because they don't trust the driver. So there's an interesting, there's a safety number. Not universally, but it's interesting to delve into that. But time and price were the main factors. I did want to say one thing, though, related to your question. A lot of why we're looking at this, I think, is that it portends people's preferences in a world of automated vehicles, but it isn't entirely the same because TNCs have a driver, and that may impact people's choices to be with others or not. And if you had a vehicle without a driver, I would suspect that some people would be more reluctant to get into that because of two people versus a larger vehicle with a bus driver or a big train car where you can move around or something like that. So.
Nicole, want to dive in?
Yeah, a few thoughts. So on the kind of longitudinal collection of mobility on demand data and research, this is something we are looking into working potentially with Susan Shaheen at UC Berkeley. We recognize there's a big gap in terms of what we know and how we can collect data on mobility on demand services. Part of that has to do with the fact that there, to my knowledge, is not a formal category for it yet in the within the National Transit Database. There are some, former categories that look at, kind of things that are like adjacent to mobility on demand, but we're missing a lot of those trips. So when we think about this and when we try to paint a picture of who's taking it, we might not be capturing all of the trips that are being taken actually on mobility on demand services. And granted, it's a relatively new service model. The other thing I think there's a huge opportunity for is, and it's come up in several ways today, is looking at the different ways different user populations use mobility on demand. We don't have a very good idea of, say, how women versus how men might use. We don't really have a good idea, I don't think, at least based on our research, of how transit dependent versus choice riders might use mobility on demand service. And so there's a lot that's still muddled in that data that I think that we can dig a little bit deeper into. And I think that, to your point, there's an enormous opportunity to kind of have some degree of longitudinal data on this somewhat emerging trend.
Colin, final thoughts.
So the question was about sort of whether there's a regional role for transit agencies, even though most micromobility regulation happens at the local level. And you use the word convene, and I think that is kind of more what transit agencies can do. There is some kind of encouragement and coordination and softer things they can do. In Denver, there's they're trying to standardize the approach to micromobility parking around transit stations. A lot of that is not happening in the city of Denver. It's like in out towards the suburbs, in places where micromobility might not be permitted yet. And so on the one hand, RTD, who's the transit agency, is taking what they're doing in the city of Denver and sort of holding that out as like, here's a good model approach to how you might want to permit these vehicles. And then also on their own real estate and agency-owned property outside the city of Denver, they're applying the same permitting process as happens in Denver. So it's sort of less of an administrative burden on the operators, and then makes things a little more standard from place to place, regardless of city limits.
Excellent. That was a fascinating discussion, so quick. I think we could discuss so much more. I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank our panelists. That was a fantastic set of thinking together.